Greetings. In this tutorial, we will connect Zend Authentication with a LDAP server to do login request handling and get the identity out of it. Also, please excuse Firefox's bug in displaying window title bar and its border. I just don't get any peace regardless of what operating system I use. A new tutorial section calls for a new branch. This one will be for one Zend Auth LDAP. So when you go to the source code on the GitHub, the content of this tutorial you can view under this branch. New dependencies we will be working with include most recent version of Zend Session, Zend Frameworks, Zend LDAP, latest version, and of course when you're ready to publish you will lock these to the whatever latest version you're comfortable releasing. But while in development, it's good to see what is the latest available so you're prepared for any changes. And of course Zend Authentication, in no particular order, doesn't matter. And then of course we go through Composer Update. And one mistake I make all the time is I forget to turn off the debug listener in my IDE, and then Composer hangs or the IDE tries to debug whatever Composer is doing and things just don't go very well. If you've seen my prerequisite videos, you may be aware that I have two directory servers, an Active Directory that manages my network, and Apache DS in favor of those who do not have access to Microsoft Server products. Connection configurations is something that the entire application needs, so I'm going to put it at the topmost configuration level available to me, and I'll put it under Global. Neither Authentication nor LDAP look out for specific keys in the configuration, so I will make up my own. Let's call them LDAP servers. And it has to be plural because Zend Auth requires that whatever we pass into its configuration is a two-dimensional array at a minimum, each one expressed in a server that we want to connect to. Even if you want a single server, you must still put it as a multi-dimensional array with the main one containing at least one of whatever server you want to use. So we've got one there, and I also have a secondary one. Different LDAP vendors or identity management server vendors have different ways of connecting to them. Documentation gives you a pretty decent overview of the differences with the major one, the Active Directory version, the second one, and the Open LDAP version, the first one. We're not really the LDAP, we are Apache DS, so even that's going to be different from this one, but not a whole lot of different. We can still get the basic gist of what the config should look like. The biggest difference I see in the Open LDAP that the Zend Framework people picked for this is that it needs a username and password just to establish a connection, which is something pretty unusual in my opinion for an LDAP server, where the connection authentication is in itself a request for permission to browse other objects. In terms of a login server, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to log in order to log in. Once you log in, you would expect that all the permissions that you have give you access to whatever objects you're entitled to. This is in contrast to relational databases where you do need credentials to establish a connection, and once you do, you have access to the entire data set, and then it's the responsibility of your application to restrict the user from running queries that they shouldn't. In the case of identity servers, the connection itself to the database will restrict you from seeing what you shouldn't see. So I'll fill out the details for my server. The first key that you definitely need is the name of the server itself, who's processing your request. In my case, it's DC server, my subdomain for the lab, and then my top main domain. Active Directory does need the TLS flag, one of the requirements for it. Account, domain name, pretty straightforward as well. What is the domain under which the accounts are stored? Simply the same name as my DNS. This one may not be so evident if you haven't done a lot of sysadmin work in your days, but essentially this is one way to represent a domain, but there's an alternative way that some applications look at the networks is through this name. So essentially, when we look at the user name the way the server sees it, we have the full name that looks almost like an email address, and then an alternative way, the way we log into the actual computers, is through the short name / the name of the user. Following that, we need a base DN from where the usernames will be looked up. DN stands for distinguished name, and it represents the path in the tree that we have to walk through to get to our destination. So we've got the top DC, and we go down to users, and we're going down to whatever username we have. You can keep it as generic as possible and just specify the topmost, and then whenever you look for username, the server will just scan the entire tree. Or you can speed things up if you know exactly ahead of time where the users are going to be. So I'll do that here. I'm not going to create any special units for this, and I'll just say common name, CN for common name. Users, that is where all the users that I will be logging in will be found. Underneath the main component of AD, underneath the main component of my very long and hard to type domain name, and come. Final thing we're missing is the form of the accounts. They are called canonical forms, and the Zend Framework gives us 4 available versions. The one that works best with Active Directory is the / version. This essentially gives us the ability to have usernames in this format. Alternative forms that may be appealing to you is the principal name, which is that @ sign that we saw, like that. I will stick with / because this format is the most cross-platform for other LDAP servers. So I know I will be able to use this for any other type of connection I have, even though personally I would prefer the one with the @ sign. For full details of the available ones, you can look at the table down in the same page. The canonical form, you have 2 other choices. You can just have the name by itself without any designation of the domain with an @ sign, and the / that we're using. If you want to follow along with Apache DS, somewhat similar but different enough that it can give you a headache if you don't know the differences. So this is my alternative directory server for that. Apache ds.ad, alextechadventures.com. It happens to live on port 10389. Account canonical form, we just discussed that. And this is where the difference can get annoying, because in this case, not only the IDE cannot reliably complete my code for some reason, but we also have a difference in the way they see usernames. So this form with the domain name / followed by the username, Active Directory sees that as form /, while Apache DS sees the exact same name as account form DN. And it's just one of those things that can keep you up all night, but if you know what to look for, if you've seen my tutorials, you are prepared. Account domain name, the alternative one I have, then we got account domain short, same one, and I should probably put them in the same order so it looks as similar as possible. Then we got base DN, and the structure is a slightly different one. When we look at what we got, we are under DC, DS, DCL, Second Adventures, DCCOM, but we happen to be under organizational unit users, not just CN of users, but organizational unit of users. That one is not a server-specific difference, but more of how you lay out your server difference. And because Apache DS doesn't by default come with the CN of users, I have to make my own organizational unit. So that's purely my own change, not the server change, unlike the canonical form. So base DN, the users that we're logging in are going to be found underneath the branch of users, DC for the main component. These abbreviations take slight getting used to, so I tend to repeat them for a while until they stick to me. Comes a common name, CN, DN, distinguished name, shows you how to walk through a tree. There's actually one more piece that's missing, but I will leave that as a surprise for when we get a very certain message later. To get inspiration on what to do with these configurations, let's expand the authentication namespace sources. We're given Authentication Service object and an interface for it. So the interface implies that we can make our own versions of the service, but one thing we do not see is a factory for them. A lot of the times when the creation of an object is complex, we get a factory, and then we call the factory as a service to Service Manager, and that way get a service object. But we're not given one, so we're expected to either instantiate it on a per need basis, or actually do create my own Service Manager entry for it. What factories do I talk about? Let's quickly expand ZendDB. We have a module underneath it. We get dependency config, which tells us that there are factories within the adapters. So that's an example of a service factory here, which does the complex instantiation for us. Looks like we will be creating our own. So we can do that somewhere underneath SRC. And let's make a namespace for Authentication. Do a parallel one for tests. And the PHP unit object for it. Authentication factory test. I do not want to be editing this line every time, so I will edit my style templates and not have a new line created for every bracket in the function and class name. End of line. Okay, for that we need this factory, to create Authentication Service. And the way we want to do it is auth service factory equals new Authentication Service factory. Create a class for it with Alt Enter, create class. The directory, we're going to go to src authentication. Okay. We see it pop here, namespace authentication, and not quite correct because it needs to be ZFT authentication. Minor change, and fix the import here. Also, minor mistake we made, it's ZFT test, not just ZFT. A quick reminder from previous tutorial that a factory which is not an abstract factory has an invoke method, which means this class is actually treated as a function. Therefore, the auth service is going to be derived from auth service factory function like that. And then the auth service variable that gets output of this invocable is assert instance of, the expected is Authentication Service from Zend. Class and actual is the auth service that we are getting. So notice how I use unit tests not just to say that I am writing them and being a good person making them perform actual code, but they are also very convenient to generate actual class definitions. At the moment we cannot use this object as a function because we haven't yet implemented factory interface from Service Manager, and once we do, we need to implement invoke, and we don't need a constructor for this one. Big question now, how do we get to the configurations up from the config folder? They get magically inserted through a configuration service from the Service Manager. So wherever we have this container interface, which is a pointer to Zend Framework Service Manager, we can say config is sm get configuration. Possibly even bigger question is how do we get these configurations into unit test when we don't have a module to collect all together. To see what this looks like in general, let's cheat a little bit and put our factory definition before we complete the unit test. So the authentication is going to be made up of from Authentication Service factory. So now when we refresh the page, we will hit the configuration fetch, and we see we got the LDAP servers configuration we defined in globals available here. This needs to be preserved in tests to satisfy Zend authentication requirements. Back in test, we need to make an isolated Service Manager instance. Private SM, which is Service Manager. And we will instantiate it during a setup process. Where we make a new instance of it. And we supply service called configuration. The definition for the service is going to be the array from the autoload. So the annoying part is to get into the autoload folder from where we are. So that's going to take a lot of upwards navigation. So right now we're here, up some more. So we're in tests, a little bit more up. There we go, we're at the root. So config, application config no, autoload, and global PHP. So now when we do auth service factory, we pass in an instance of the service manager, and we specify by requirement that the second parameter is the name of the service we're asking for. We're going to try and debug this. And let's check. Config isn't quite what we're looking for, most likely because we forgot to put include or rather require next to the directory name. Try that again. And now config is our array. Of course, test itself is going to fail because we're not returning anything yet. So let's do just that. We'll make authentication, new authentication service from Zend, return it, and at least that much should now pass. In order for authentication service to do its job, it needs to have an adapter of what we are authenticating against. So this, we're going to assert instance of expected is the adapter interface from authentication adapter auth service get adapter. You can introduce adapter at two places, one during the authentication process itself or ahead of time. I like it to be ahead of time, that way the factory can get it already and it's easier to test. This will of course fail. So back at the factory, create adapter, new LDAP adapter, which is a nicer name of Zend Authentication Adapter LDAP. This adapter needs to have options. That is the configurations that we fetched earlier from Service Manager, and the key that we used for the connections is LDAP servers. And finally, pass the adapter to the authentication service. That should pass the test. This is a good place to commit our work. This one was just our scratch code, so we'll revert it. Authentication Service Factory, test, module, which has the service definition, and composer with the library dependencies. Add Zend Authentication Service Factory. Having the service created, a good place to use it would be at the beginning of every request just before we hit the controller action. We can do that in portal module class, and this requires knowledge of Event Manager, which we haven't covered yet, so we will go through this in the simplest possible way just to get something going. E is actually an instance of MVC event, not strictly event interface, so it will help if we're directly casted. We need to get application, and from the application we need Event Manager, and attach to an MVC event of type dispatch. When that event occurs, we're going to call a function which will also take MVC event, and it's going to use the application object we captured earlier. And from this application, we're going to grab Service Manager and get our authentication. So let's see how well that works. Breakpoint, back to our site, and here we go. Here is our auth service. Give it a type, Authentication Service. Two important functions that we can call here is whether we have an identity or not. Auth service has identity, and what that identity actually is. So auth service get identity. At the moment, has identity will be false, and this identity won't return anything. And here we go, false and null. Now if you put breakpoint here and in the controller at the same time, what we will have is that the controller gets hit before the event. So to correct that, we need to make sure that this goes a higher priority than the controller dispatch. Controller dispatch is in negative numbers, so we just need to make something that is priority higher than it. So having this as the last parameter in the event will ensure that instead of the index controller being hit first, we get the event handler hit first and then the controller. To perform actual authentication, I'm going to cheat some more and use my controller as a scratch pad again. I'm going to need an authentication here, which I don't really have. So I will inject it up here. Private auth service, make it authentication service, bring it in as dependency, and have the factory pass it in. Service manager get authentication of service. Quickly check that I do indeed have it. Yes, that's good. To do the actual authentication, I will get adapter from it. Since the adapter interface only has the authenticate method, and it doesn't know about the fact that LDAP specific adapter allows us to set username and password, we will have to cast it. Not Zend LDAP, but authentication adapter LDAP, major difference. So to see what I mean by the interface being different is if we look at the abstract adapter interface, the only thing we get is the authenticate method. So that's why it did not originally know about the fact that we can get credential functions from the adapter interface alone. We had to cast it to LDAP. So set credential, that's actually the password, and the username is identity. So identity pretty much stands for username, and credential stands for password. Let's make sure we have an account ready to use. We'll make one under users, user Zend tutorial, ZF tutorial for the logo name, and we'll say ZFT 2016 exclamation for password. Let's do the same thing here. UID. Let's do the same thing here. iNetwork person. It's going to be identified by UID ZF tutorial. Common name Zend tutorial. Last name tutorial, UID ZF tutorial. I give it a password. Same ZFT 2016 exclamation mark. Okay, finish. Put that in our code. Yes, we're going to hard code it. And having those set on the adapter, we can go back to Authentication Service and perform the authentication. And we can see the result from it. We get a beautiful error as the reward for our efforts. We're told that an unknown option-based DN is given to the LDAP object. Now, we haven't worked with LDAP itself, we've only worked with LDAP adapter for the authentication service. So let's go see what this LDAP, that is the LDAP itself, has to say about itself. Go on over to the structure view. It complained that there was a problem setting options. So let's see what set options does. In options, we have a list of all the parameters that it accepts. Incidentally, these are the same options that we have put in here. So that's a very important point to make. The options that we have in the configurations match the set options method of whatever component you're trying to configure. So if you don't know what to put in the configurations, there's a good chance you get your answer in the set option functions of whatever component you're configuring. What it also does is it doesn't just blindly accept the options, it also checks whether the option given is within the list of the options that it supports. So we are told that base DN is not one of the allowed options. Is it in the list? It is, but it has a small case n as opposed to capital N, which means that as it loops through the array that we give it in this for each, and the array key doesn't exist, we give an exception. That's the exception that we are witnessing. So this time the fix is pretty simple. We just have to comply with the exact key name that it supports in the list. So it looks like I've been lying to you all this time by making a configuration D capital N. How horrible of me. So rename that to small case n. Account the name short still has a problem. Yes, I didn't name this consistently between main DC and Apache DC, and they're also out of order, so let's fix that one time. And here we go. Let's look at the result. The result has identity of the type tutorial and code -1. Why is it -1? -1 stands for account not found. But do not jump to conclusions. If we look a bit further, we have actually a connection error. The problem is that it's not that the account couldn't be found on the server, it's that we couldn't connect to the server at all. So it's a misleading error message, and you have to really read it thoroughly to see what the real problem is. The reason why that is failing to connect is because we need to do a trust certificate between our LDAP server and the PHP. Installation of trust certificates is kind of complicated, so what you can do alternatively is to create a file under C open LDAP sysconf LDAPconf like that. Already had it prepared, and it must have this line TLS_xcert never. So this means it's not going to verify the origin of the certificate. Definitely not recommended for production environment. Barely okay for development playing around. Once you have the file created in this exact location, and on Linux the alternative is etc LDAP LDAPconf, and only a few weeks ago this would be my main file, but for now I'm back on Windows. Once you have this file in there, do not forget to restart your server fully. My window manager still has some problems. Restart everything. Once restarted, back to the site. Result is now 1, not -1. And the message is first two empty, authentication successful. How amazing. Let's verify that this also works for Apache DS. The way authentication adapters work is they will cycle through every server that you give it, and it's going to accept the first successful one. So if this one fails, it's going to roll over to the next one. So we want to force it go into the second one. So comment out the first configuration. It's going to go straight for Apache DS. Let's look at the result of that. -1, why is that? And this is the surprise they promised at the beginning of the tutorial. The last message states that it could not find an object for this query. If you wondered up to this point, how does Zend Authentication finds the account in the directory server or any other backend that you may choose, it has a bunch of predefined queries. If you did not wonder about that, consider that as a caution for yourself, because if any component ever does something similarly magical, there is a good chance it's not always going to get it right, and there is a default that you might not be aware of that you should verify works for your case, or you can expand on to get even better results. This query comes from the adapter option account filter format, and we see that it has a default object class user SMA account %s. So it will take the user account that we're trying to log in with, which is the identity, and is going to construct a string. So when we search for it, ZF tutorial, we're not going to find anything. But now if we go to Active Directory server, for which that query is optimized, find, custom search, advanced query, we got our user. So we see now that authentication is actually optimized for Active Directory. Not a big deal, we just have to apply this parameter to our configuration. So back up here we go. And I like to put in even default configurations, because default configurations tell me what's going on. If I skip them, then I tend to forget or even not be aware of what is happening. So I'll follow my practice and I will take this in and I will put it in here, even though I know that's always going to happen. And as far as Apache DS, that has a slightly different structure because it does not use SMA account. Let's take this first here. What it uses instead is UID, as we agreed when we created a username. UID is going to be our unique identifier for the user. And what class is it going to be? It's going to be inet.org person. Net.org person. And UID is going to be the lookup parameter. And before we put a query there, we can also test it out. We can say new search and put in like that. There we go, we got our user. Let's verify configurations one more time. We want to make sure we're using Apache, and we need to also adjust this because we are not using common name, we're using OU, organizational unit, to get the users from, and we are actually on DS. And inet.org person and searching for ID, so now expect this to work. And we get the result, code 1, which is success, message, everything is good. Since everything is working now, it's a good time to commit. First, we got to commit the connection changes. So fix connection configuration. And then we can commit the fact that we added some sample usage of the authentication service. So add sample Zend authentication usage. What do we get as a result of successful authentication? If we look back at the module, the identity is now going to be filled in. As identity became true, an identity becomes the object that has been returned from the server. Additionally, during logon time, one way we can check whether the result is successful without having to parse the array of messages and looking out for the 1 versus -1 is to say whether it is successful. So is successful, and say result is valid. Success here is true because the username and the password has passed. Now beware that authentication request will occur regardless if there's already an existing identity or not. It will just override it. So ideally, you would want to have a check that looks at the value of identity and only performs the authentication if identity is false.